Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfoud, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En Route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.
The title of the talk for tonight is The Virtue of Faith in Biblical Judaism and Catholicism. In the last lecture series, we looked at the mystery of Israel and the Church, and we focused on salvation history. So in this second series, we'll focus on themes of faith, and we'll start by investigating, well, what is faith, the nature of faith, and reasons for belief, why we believe in the Catholic faith. And we'll look at reasons for belief in Judaism as well. In the coming talks, we'll look at other themes of faith. We'll look at the faith of Abraham and Mary in the next talk, and we'll look at faith from a more personal, spiritual dimension next time. This time it'll be more objective, the reasons for believing in general, objectively. Okay. So in order to understand supernatural faith, religious faith, we first have to look at what is faith in general. Right? What does it mean to believe? So we can say that faith, in general, human faith also, it's a firm assent of the mind to things unseen. Okay? So there are two parts to it. It's an act that's firm, but it has an object that you can't see, obviously with your senses, but not even with the reasoning power of the mind. Okay, some things we know that are true, we see that they're self-evident with the mind, like 2 + 2 is 4, or something can't be and not be at the same time in the same way. Right? The mysteries of faith, the things that we believe, aren't things like that. They're things that do not appear evident at all, such that God is, for example, Trinity, or that God became man. Okay, so they're things that we can't see with the eyes or with the reason. And thus those two things, firmness and unseen, are what characterize faith. If either of those two are missing, we can't really speak of faith. Or we could define it by saying faith is the assent of the mind to truths motivated not because we see that it's true or because it seems reasonable to us, but by a firm impulse of the will, motivated by a witness, by the testimony of a witness. Right? That's faith. We believe something not because we see it, but because my will moves me to believe. And why does my will move me to believe? On somebody's authority that I trust. Okay, that's faith. And so we have to evaluate that the witness is worthy of trust. So the act of faith, even though it's in something unseen, and it's moved by my will, it's not arbitrary or unreasonable, because there's a witness that I have reason to think is trustworthy. Right? Now, we make the act of faith, human faith, all day long, every day of our life. Right? We couldn't live without it. We wouldn't know, for example, the identity of our parents. That my father is really my biological father, except by faith in his word, in something I didn't see. And the same thing is true of what we learn in school. Most of what we learn in school we take on faith, at least first, and then maybe later we'll come to see some of it. We trust in the authority of teachers, in the media, too much, in public opinion, in friends. And so human life is based on faith, simply human faith. Now, faith, we could say, if we compare it to other kinds of knowing, it's halfway in between scientific knowledge and opinion. In scientific knowledge, we have certainty about something, but because we see it. Right? In opinion, We don't see it, and it's like faith, but we don't have the firmness in an opinion. We've got a doubt that maybe what we think is not true. So faith, it's like opinion in that we don't see it. We don't see the object of our belief. But it's unlike opinion because we're certain about what we believe, whereas we're not certain about our opinions. Or we shouldn't be. Faith is like scientific knowing in its certainty, but it's unlike scientific knowing in that we don't see the object of what we're certain of. Okay? So in that sense, faith is, we could say, halfway between opinion on the one hand and scientific knowledge on the other. So if somebody has a religious opinion that they're afraid is not perhaps the truth, that's not faith. Okay? It's important to distinguish those. Faith has a certainty, and we'll see why. Why is faith certain? Well, the only reason to have certainty on a matter of faith is because the witness is absolutely trustworthy. Right? So supernatural faith, or religious faith, which we're talking about here, is distinguished from human faith, not because it's seen or unseen, or it's because of the difference of the witness. In religious faith, the witness is God. And in human faith, the witness is another human being. Okay, so faith is, we say, supernatural when it rests on the authority of God, who can't deceive us or be deceived. So if we want a definition of faith, we can define it as a supernatural virtue by which we believe firmly the truths that God has revealed because of God's truthfulness, who can't deceive us or deceive himself. And so faith, supernatural faith, has a certainty greater than any other act of knowing that we can do in this life. Because even what seems self-evident to me, to my reason, could be mistaken because my mind is not infallible. Right? But faith, because it rests on the witness of God, who is infallible, has a greater certainty. Right? And furthermore, you can see that belief, very often people say, well, faith isn't reasonable. But what could be more reasonable than being certain about what God says? Right? If God says something, it would be unreasonable not to believe it. Totally unreasonable. Right? And there would be nothing more reasonable than believing it. So human faith can err, right? But divine faith, or supernatural faith, cannot err as long as it's really God who has spoken. Of course, the difficulty is identifying where God has spoken, right? That's the difficulty. Okay, so when should we believe? We should believe when the witness is God. And how do we know that God is the witness? Well, before I get into that, we call that the motives of credibility. Before I get into the motives of credibility, one more thing. So the act of faith, it has its certainty because it rests on God's witness. Therefore, the very nature of the act of faith is a kind of hearing, whereas the nature of scientific knowing is a kind of seeing. Right? And I don't know, in science I see something to be true, and even in philosophy, I see that something cannot be and not be at the same time. I see that you can't have an effect without a cause. The nature of faith, of religious faith, is different. It's not a seeing. I don't see that God is a Trinity. I don't see that God has become man, or I don't see that Christ is substantially present in the Eucharist. Okay, so faith is a hearing. It's a kind of hearing. It's hearing God's Word. And we see this in the Bible, right from the beginning. In the Old Testament, the fundamental creed of Israel was, Moses told the people, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God is one God. And you shall love the Lord with all your heart, your soul, and all your might." Hear, O Israel. Okay, so the structure of the act of faith is a listening. And the same thing is true in the New Testament. St. Paul tells us in the letter to the Romans, faith comes from what is heard, from hearing. And what is heard comes from the preaching of Christ. Okay, so faith rests on the witness, ultimately, of Christ, of God made man. But the great difficulty, we said, is to determine where has God spoken. Okay, and so reason has to come into play there. Reason has to evaluate signs that it's really God who has spoken and not, say, an imposter or a charlatan. In other words, if God wants to reveal himself to mankind, he has to show us that he has really spoken. And therefore he has to do something that only he can do to show us that what he has said comes from him and not from anybody else. Okay? So when we find in the Old Testament that, for example, Moses speaks in the name of God, he has to have some kind of divine credentials to show us that he's speaking in God's name. Right? And the same thing is true of Christ, in the Messiah, in the New Testament, and of the apostles. They have to have divine credentials that they're God's spokesman. And the church is the same. The church today has to have some kind of credentials. So what are these credentials? Well, they're above all, if they're things that only God can do, they have to be miracles. Basically, to believe without miracles would be unreasonable. It would be unreasonable to accept that God has spoken in the world if it didn't have some kind of stamp that it came from him by means of something that only he can do. And that's what we mean by a miracle. Now, I'm going to distinguish here in this talk three kinds of miracles. The ordinary kind of miracles like healings, raising someone from the dead, stopping the sun. And then there's another kind of miracle is a prophecy, foretelling a future event. Again, that's a kind of miraculous thing that only God can do. And a third thing that we'll look at is the people formed by God's revelation. So the people of Israel and the church as a kind of moral miracle. So that'll be our plan. We'll look first at miracles, prophecies, and then Israel and the church as signs that God has truly spoken. Okay, so let's begin with miracles in general. So when God, and we'll take as our example Moses. So when God spoke to Moses, the first thing he did was he called his attention by means of a miracle. Right? Moses saw this burning bush that wasn't consumed. And so he stopped to see what this was. And then when God asked him to be his messenger to go to Pharaoh, to take his people out of Egypt, out of the house of bondage, Moses asked, naturally, for some kind of sign to show Pharaoh and the people so that they believe him. Because otherwise, they would simply dismiss him as a lunatic. So let's just read that text. It's on the bottom of page 3, if you want to look up. Moses said, "Behold, they will not believe me or listen to my voice, for they will say, 'The Lord didn't really appear to you.' So the Lord said to him, 'What is that in your hand?' He said, 'A rod.' And God said, 'Cast it on the ground.' So he cast it on the ground, and it became a serpent. And Moses fled from it. But the Lord said to Moses, 'Put out your hand and take it by the tail.' So he put out his hand and caught it, and it became a rod in his hand. That they may believe that the Lord, the God of their fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob, has appeared to you." Okay, so Moses asked for a sign to show the people, a miraculous sign, that God had spoken. Right? And God gave him a miraculous sign through his staff. And then we know what happened. That staff worked the 10 plagues before the witness of Pharaoh, the sons of Israel, and the Egyptians. And then that rod worked the crossing of the Red Sea, the stopping of the waters and the separating. And then they had the column of fire and the column of cloud. Column of fire by night and the column of cloud by day that led them. Then they had the manna in the desert for 40 years, raining down nourishment. They had the water that Moses brought out from the rock by his staff. They had the fire on Mount Sinai with the giving of the law, and the thunder and the tablets carved with the finger of God. So every step of the way was marked by stupendous manifest miracles that were something objective, something witnessed by everyone, even by those who didn't believe, right? Even by Pharaoh and the Egyptians. So Moses is constantly reminding the people that God brought them out of Egypt with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. And that, of course, refers to all of those miracles. And we see the same pattern throughout the Old Testament. Right? The sign that God has spoken is always miracles. Miracles witnessed objectively by believers and unbelievers at the same time, and which made a historical impact that stands at the very founding of the people of Israel. In other words, the very continued existence of the people of Israel was a sign, a reminder that those things had occurred, because that was the very founding of their nation and their sense of identity. To take another example, with the prophet Elijah, a beautiful example, the people had fallen into the worship of Baal, the Canaanite god. And Elijah challenged the prophets of Baal to a kind of duel. And the duel was they would invoke their Baal, and he would invoke the Lord, to send fire down from heaven to consume a sacrifice without lighting it. And so we know the story. The prophets of Baal put out their slaughtered animal, and they danced and they slashed themselves until they were covered with blood, and nothing happened. And Elijah made fun of them. He said, "Perhaps your Baal is asleep. You have to shout louder," etc. And then after they gave up, he put out his offering, and he doused the whole area with water 3 times and invoked the Lord, and fire came down from heaven, consumed the offering, and the people killed the prophets of Baal. And so when the people saw it, this is from 1 Kings, chapter 18, they fell on their faces and they said, "The Lord, He is God. The Lord, He is God." Okay, so again, the key thing is, how do you recognize that God is the Lord and not Baal? Well, because the true God can work a miracle and a false God cannot. We could go on, but I'll spare you. And just to pass to the New Testament, we see the same pattern, right? Christ, from the beginning of his public ministry, testifies that he is who he says he is, and what is that the Messiah, and more than the Messiah, the Son of God, by working miracles. Right? We know it was begun by Our Lady's intercession, Mary's intercession, at the wedding in Cana, the first miracle to start his, in a sense, Our Lady inaugurated his public ministry by asking for that sign of the turning of the water into wine. And not just a little water, but a tremendous quantity of water turned into wine. 6 gigantic containers. And so we see that his teaching was constantly accompanied by miracles to show the truth of his claim. For example, when John the Baptist was imprisoned, he sent messengers to Jesus asking, "Are you the one that Israel was awaiting?" And Jesus replied, not by his own word, but by citing the miracles that he'd worked. He says, "Go and tell John what you hear and see. The blind receive their sight, the lame walk, lepers are cleansed, the dead hear, and the dead are raised up. Right? He raised 3 people from the dead. And the poor have the good news preached to them. Or again, he said to the people in Jerusalem on the feast of Hanukkah, the works that I do in my Father's name, they bear witness to me. If I'm not doing the works of my Father, then do not believe me. But if I do them, even though you do not believe me, believe the works, that you may know and understand that the Father is in me, and I am in the Father. Okay, so the witness, the support for the trustworthiness of his claim is the fact that he does these things that no one else can do and has ever done before or since on that scale, except perhaps Moses. But there's a difference. Right? Moses did those works, in a sense, in the name of the Lord, whereas Jesus did his works in his own name, because he is the Lord. So all of his great teachings were preceded by miracles to show the truth of the teaching. One of the great examples is when he wanted to preach on the Eucharist in the synagogue in Capernaum, he preceded it the day before by the miracle of the loaves and the fishes, right? The multiplication of the loaves to feed the 5,000. Another great miracle was the raising of Lazarus shortly before his own resurrection. Right? That was the event that actually precipitated his death, his passion. That was the last straw. When Caiaphas saw the raising of Lazarus, they said, we have to stop him, or all of Judea will be after him. And the very birth of the church, we'll look at this in a minute, was preceded by the great miracle of Pentecost, the speaking in tongues. And then the apostles worked miracles. The Acts of the Apostles tells us that First Peter, he would simply pass by the street and his shadow had the power to heal the sick. And the same thing happened then with St. Paul later, when St. Paul did his missionary journeys. So we see that there's a perfect harmony between the Old Testament and the New with regard to this sign that it would be unreasonable to believe unless the witness, the divine witness, had the credential of miracles. And indeed, we see in the entire history of the church that same claim. The very fact that the church requires 2 miracles for the canonization of a saint, and 2 miracles attested by the witness of science, with a devil's advocate who will argue against them, and that it finds those miracles for every saint that's canonized is astounding. Right? So those miracles continue today. And another great example is, for example, Lourdes, that we celebrated on Monday, the 150th anniversary of Our Lady's apparition in Lourdes in France. And since that time, there have been countless cures, of which 67 have been officially attested as things that science cannot explain. Right? The number is far greater, but those are the ones that have been officially tested and recorded as scientifically inexplicable. Or we could cite Fatima. The seers predicted that on Our Lady's last apparition, there would be a sign that would be visible. And so 70,000 people came to the site of the apparition in 1917 in Fatima, and many of them unbelieving, many of them communists, journalists, etc., and they witnessed the sign of the sun falling, swirling in the sky, witnessed by 70,000 people. In any case, the point is that such miracles continue to our day, right, as a motive of credibility in the claim of the church. Okay, let's pass on to the second motive of credibility, prophecy. So since God is omniscient, and only God is omniscient, only God can know what will happen in the future. We can make some kind of reasonable prediction, but it's bound to fail, usually. Right? And sometimes you might be right, but it's only because you've kept it so general and vague that you could say that it was correct. That's how the ancient oracle of Delphi worked. That when they came to Delphi to ask the soothsayer, to ask the god Apollo who would win a battle, there's a famous story that one of the kings of Asia Minor went to Delphi and asked that story. Would he win in this battle? And so the oracle gave a response that was vague enough to make him think that they were saying he would win, but it equally meant that somebody would lose a kingdom and somebody would gain a kingdom. It just so happened that it wasn't him, but his opponent. Anyway, prophecy on the human scale is a conjecture. Only God can make a prophecy that's detailed and exact. Now, and this is precisely what Moses says about prophecy in Deuteronomy. He says that there will be prophets in Israel, and the test that a prophet is a true prophet is if what he foretells comes to pass as he has foretold it. This Deuteronomy chapter 18. He says, if you say in your heart, how may we know the word which the Lord has not spoken? In other words, how can we distinguish a true prophet from a false prophet? When a prophet speaks in the name of the Lord, if the word doesn't come to pass or come true, that is a word which the Lord has not spoken. The prophet has spoken it presumptuously. And so, in the history of Israel, we find two classes of prophets. The true prophets, which compose our Bible, part of our Bible, and the false prophets, who always predicted more optimistic things. For example, the true prophets predicted the exile, a calamity that was really basically inconceivable for Israel, that the entire people would be exiled, that the temple would be destroyed, etc. And so the people tended to believe the false prophets who said, peace will come, you will prevail, they won't exile you, etc. And the true prophets, like Jeremiah, Isaiah, Amos, they were hated. They were persecuted with terrible... Jeremiah was put in this dry well, basically to starve to death. Well, they took him out. And Isaiah ended his life by being sawn in half. In any case, the mark, though, of the true prophet is that what he predicted came to pass. And that's why their works were preserved and given that veneration of inspiration, of being the Word of God. Now, Isaiah, for example, he foretold the exile, and he foretold the return after the exile, and even foretold the name of the pagan king who would allow them to return, Cyrus. The prophet Daniel made very precise predictions of the succession of Persian kings after his time, the conquest of Alexander, and the tribulations in the Maccabean period under the king Antiochus. That's in Daniel 11. Now, unfortunately, many biblical exegetes simply don't believe these prophecies because it seems like can't be done. Who could know the future? Well, I mean, it obviously takes faith. And so many biblical exegetes say these things were written after the fact, that it's presented as if it were a prophecy, and that's how they date it. They say, the date of, for example, the book of Isaiah, at least the part where he speaks of the exile, must have been written during exile. And the part where he speaks of the return after the exile must have been written after the return. And that's, by the way, why many biblical scholars speak of three Isaiahs, because of these three prophecies. Obviously, I don't hold that view, right? Because if God is speaking, then he can know what will happen. And it's not very difficult, it seems to me, to believe that he can do that if he exists and if he reveals himself to mankind. Now, some prophecies cannot be explained in that way, that they were a prophecy written after the fact. The most important, obviously, are the messianic prophecies. Right? Nobody could say that, well, that prophecy of Isaiah about the virgin birth was written after the event, right? Because we know that the whole Old Testament existed centuries before the birth of Christ. In fact, it was translated into Greek 250 years before the birth of Christ. And so all of those messianic prophecies could in no way have been written after the event. And so it's really the messianic prophecies that most clearly show the fact that God spoke in Israel. Right? In other words, the absolute, the credibility of the Old Testament is shown first and foremost by the fact that its messianic prophecies were fulfilled in Jesus Christ. We talked about this in the first cycle, so I won't burden you with it. But we saw that there were hundreds of messianic prophecies detailing all the aspects of Jesus' life. When he would come, more or less the time. Of what lineage? The line of Abraham, the line of David, etc. Where? Bethlehem. How he would come. He would be a suffering servant. He would redeem the people through suffering, Isaiah 53, etc., etc. Okay, so those prophecies are a sign that God has spoken, because no one could have predicted such events in 600 BC or 700 BC by any human means. So you see how the Old and the New Testaments reinforce each other. Right? The Old Testament gains in firmness, in credibility, by the New, because the New is the testimony that those prophecies in the Old Testament were true. In other words, were from God and not simply from, the religious sensibility of the Hebrew people. Right? So the Old and the New Testaments together form an indestructible harmony, each reinforcing the other. Okay, let's go on to the third kind of witness, the people of God. Now, the problem with the prophecies still stand today. So the prophecies are still a motive of credibility. But sometimes people have a difficulty with the first one that we talked about, the miracles. Because they say, well, I didn't see those miracles. Perhaps they're just simply legends. And so it makes sense that God would want there to be another kind of witness that we can see today in front of us. And that's the witness of the people formed by those past miracles. So even though I myself didn't witness the multiplication of the loaves and fishes or the speaking in tongues at Pentecost, I witnessed their effect today. Their effect today is the church. And the same thing is true in the Old Testament. I didn't witness the 10 plagues in Egypt. I didn't witness the crossing of the Red Sea. But what do I witness? I witness a people still here today that couldn't possibly be reasonably expected to continue to exist. The people of Israel. Right? They shouldn't exist today. All the other peoples, so they came into Canaan. Right? They conquered the Jebusites, the Hittites, the et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Where are those people today? Right? They're lost to history centuries and millennia ago. But this people still exists. And how does it exist? It exists without a land, without a country for 2,000 years, the Jewish people. Without a homeland. Is there any other people that continues to maintain its identity after 2,000 years of being deprived of any geographical home? Now it's reacquired it in the second half of the 20th century, but for 2,000 years it was without it. Right? And it maintained its identity, and not just any identity, but an identity that's unshakable. And that identity couldn't possibly exist if those miracles worked by Moses that formed that identity weren't true. Right? So that's how the people continues to be a witness to those miracles that I didn't see, but which explain the continued existence of that people that received them. And we can say the same thing about the church. Right? The expansion of the church. In the creed, we say we believe in one holy Catholic and apostolic church. We call those the 4 marks or notes of the church. And those are miraculous signs because they're not things that we ought to expect to exist in the world. That there be one people that exists in the entire world. So it's one. Catholic means universal. So that there be a church that's one and yet universal in every part of the world, the Catholic Church exists. It speaks every tongue. And it's still one. It has the same faith as it did in the year 33. And we can show that historically by looking at the councils and what they taught and what we believe today. We can compare the catechism with the councils and papal writings of all the centuries. We find we have the same faith. And we find that we have the same government, that the church in each age is built on Peter, on a pope, on the successor of Peter. And now we've had 264 or 65 of them. And so we have the same line of government. And if we look out in the world and look for something similar, I don't know, the Roman Empire, what do we find? Yes, there were some Caesars that continued, although it lasted for a few centuries and then fizzled out. Egypt had different dynasties, but it no longer exists today. We think our country is old, 200 years of having a stable government, which is marvelous, but 200 years is not 2,000 years. And so the fact of the church being one and yet universal all through the world and built on the apostles having the exact same foundation, Peter and his successors, and the apostles and their successors, which are the bishops, that's a sign that, humanly speaking, can't be explained. And in fact, in every time, there were people who thought that they could end the church. Nero thought he could do away with the church, and he didn't succeed. And the same thing went for the other Caesars. Napoleon, much, much later, or Luther, thought he could do away with the Catholic Church. He made a prediction. In 1520, he said, 2 more years, and the papacy will be ruined. And obviously it didn't come true. Napoleon thought he could eliminate the Catholic Church. He came to Italy, to Rome, and he took the Pope prisoner, brought him back to Paris, and the papacy continued. And Napoleon's empire fell. Hitler thought he could do away with the papacy. Stalin, likewise. Right? Stalin has the famous question, how many legions does the Pope have? And so it goes. Right? So that continued existence of the church is another sign or motive of credibility that God has truly spoken 2,000 years ago in the founder of that church, Jesus Christ. Okay, just as Israel is a testimony that God truly spoke through Moses 3,400 years ago. And finally, those are the principal motives. So we've got miracles, prophecies, and the church, or the people of God. And I'm adding a fourth here, the sanctity of the doctrine revealed. Right? Because if God speaks to man, it better be a holy doctrine. And if the doctrine isn't holy, it can't be from God. Right? And so we find this also in the Old and the New Testament as a sign of credibility. In other words, revelation ought to correspond with the aspirations of the human heart, its highest and most noble aspirations. And if it doesn't, conscience bears witness that this can't be the Word of God. In other words, no supposed revelation that's contrary to the witness of conscience can possibly be from God. Now we find this motive of credibility throughout the Old Testament. In the book of Deuteronomy, Moses says to the people, "Behold, I have taught you statutes and ordinances, as the Lord commanded me, so that you do them in the land. Keep them and do them, for they are your wisdom and your understanding in the sight of all the peoples." In other words, the holiness of the law, of the Torah, that's the sign for all other peoples that this is from me, this is from God. For what great nation is there that has a God so near to it as the Lord our God is to us, whenever we call upon it? Right? That was said by Moses, and it's equally said by us here today. Right? What people has ever had a God so close to them that he comes to us every day, if we choose, in the Eucharist? Right? On our altars, in our church, here in St. Louis, or in any place on earth. And we find it in the Psalms over and over again, that the wisdom that the Jewish people has received through the Torah. And it's interesting when I mentioned before that the episode of the burning bush. So God appears to Moses in the burning bush. The first thing that Moses asks for is a miraculous sign, right? But then he doesn't stop there. He asks for wisdom after that. So Moses receives the miraculous sign, the staff. Then he asks for something else. He asks for the name of God. He says, what name shall I take back to the elders to tell them that the Lord has sent me? It's asking for God's name. Now, in the Bible, the name reveals the essence of a thing. So asking for God's name, in a certain sense, is asking for God's essence, who He is. And so God says to him, I am who am. Right? That's the name that He gives him. I am who am. Say this to the people of Israel, I am has sent me to you. Say this to the people, the Lord, which is that, whenever they put that, the Lord, that stands for the tetragrammaton, which was pronounced Yahweh, but which the people of Israel didn't pronounce later in their history for reverence, which means He who is. So in the earliest translation of the Bible, before Christ, from the 3rd century BC into Greek, the Greek translators translated the name Yahweh as He who is. Now what's the meaning of that? He who is. God revealed to Moses that He is the fullness of being. In other words, that God is the source, and it's like an infinite ocean of all perfection, of all goodness, of all being, and is the source of this created being that we have. Right? So in a sense, God revealed something that philosophers, St. Thomas Aquinas, with his metaphysics, he sees that revelation of God's name as being the height of metaphysics, the height of what the human mind could know about God. Now God revealed that to Moses, 1400 BC, to a very rude people with no philosophy, with no understanding of being, etc., to show us that wisdom comes first and foremost from revelation. In other words, the revelation of the Old Testament has a supernatural wisdom that human reason can hardly attain. And that's also a sign that it's true, that it's from God. And likewise, the same thing was true of the revelation that God is one. Right? Human reason can know that God is one, but with great difficulty. And in all the cultures of the world at the time of the Old Testament, up until Christianity spread, there was polytheism and idolatry. Right? The belief that there were many, many gods. It's contrary to reason. But the human mind falls into error, right? And so the fact that God revealed His oneness, that was a great sign that He had truly spoken, right? That revelation of monotheism. Now we could apply the same test to the New Testament. The teaching of Christ in the New Testament has a wisdom that is clearly supernatural, that goes beyond anything that you can explain by human philosophy. Right? Think of the Beatitudes. Blessed are the poor in spirit. And I would say, I'm a convert, and so before our conversion, I always thought that the Sermon on the Mount was just miraculous. I mean, how there was a wisdom there that couldn't be explained humanly. I mean, you compare it to, I don't know, Dante or Shakespeare, and it soars above. So we find again the perfect harmony of the wisdom of the Old Testament, the wisdom of the Revelation, and of the New. And if we look at other religions on the face of the earth, they fail that test. So for example, I don't know, polytheistic religion fails the test. Buddhism fails the test because it sees being ultimately as negative, something you want to escape from. It's a purely, the promise, we can't go into this here, but the promised nirvana is something purely negative. Ultimately, life is something negative. It's not, it's the opposite, really, of biblical revelation. Or if we look at, I don't want to get into too much controversy here, Islam or Mormonism, For example, simple moral teachings like the licitness of polygamy is a sign that a religion is not holy. If it permits something that conscience senses is not right. And if it proclaims something to be licit, which the human heart knows secretly, maybe it's hard to discover, but it knows that it's not right, that disqualifies that revelation as being from God. We'll talk more about that in a minute. And the same thing would be true of condoning the use of violence for the spreading of religion. Right? Such a view it's not compatible with God's wisdom. And this is one of the points that Benedict brought out in that famous lecture at Regensburg, if you remember, some time ago, over a year ago, which caused such a storm of protest, in which he pointed this exact fact out, that he quoted one of the Greek emperors, a Christian emperor, who said, "Show me just what Muhammad brought that was new, and there you will find things evil and inhuman, such as his command to spread by the sword the faith he preached, to spread Islamic law, Sharia law, by the sword." And so the emperor goes on to explain that that's incompatible with God being the reason, the logos, being because faith has to be spread by its persuasiveness, right? Not by force. To convince a reasonable soul, one does not need a strong arm or weapons of any kind, or any other means of threatening a person with death. Right? Now, of these motives of credibility, this last one is the hardest, I suppose, to objectively prove the sanctity of the doctrine. But in practice, it's very persuasive. Right? It's very important. And the key point, though, is that all four of them go together. Miracles and prophecies are the most objective. The people of God is also objective, although you have to have an eye to at least not clouded with prejudice so as to be able to see it. And then the sanctity of the doctrine. And all four of them are in perfect harmony, right? Showing the Catholic faith and the Jewish faith should be from God. Okay. Now, St. Thomas Aquinas has a chapter in his Summa against the nations. He wrote a Summa, it's called Contra Gentiles, which was written with the Muslim philosophers in mind. Because one of his Dominican brothers was preaching in the part of Spain in which there was a strong Muslim presence. He asked St. Thomas to write this work to refute the Muslim philosophers. And at the beginning of this work, St. Thomas has a little chapter about the reasonableness of religious belief. And he explains why it's reasonable to believe when there are motives of credibility, and why it's imprudent. It's not prudent to believe when those motives are lacking. And to explain this, he compares Catholicism and Islam. So it's very politically incorrect today, but very necessary for us today, I think, to see. So I'm just going to read a little bit of this. It's on page 8. The divine wisdom, which knows everything perfectly, willed to reveal to men his secrets. In other words, God wanted to reveal himself to man. And he manifested his presence with clear signs or witnesses, right? And those signs he's going to develop are miracles, cures, etc. And of these miracles, he singles out Pentecost, the inspiration of human minds, such that ignorant and simple people, the apostles, full of the Holy Spirit, gain in an instant the highest wisdom and eloquence. Right? So that's the founding miracle of the church. Seeing these signs, what happened? The world converted to Christianity. How? By the conquest of the sword? No, it was the exact opposite. If you converted to Christianity, what happened to you? You were likely to be crucified or burned alive or fed to the wild beasts in the Colosseum. Right? It was a very good chance. And that happened for 300 years, right? For 3 centuries. To be a Christian didn't give you any temporal advantage. On the contrary, it gave you tremendous peril. And he says, what's even more amazing is that this wasn't through some kind of doctrine that could be enticing to human passions. For example, a religion that says it's okay to have polygamy, well, that in a certain sense could be enticing to human passion. But Christianity teaches a very strict moral law. And so the fact that the world converted to this very strict moral law, and it's the same today, without any temporal incentive, in other words, without any temporal reward that you would get, the fact that the world embraced such a doctrine is really miraculous. And so St. Thomas concludes that you've got two alternatives. Either that conversion of the world was based on miracles, and that's what we believe, right? It was based on the miracle of Pentecost, the cures worked by St. Peter and Paul, etc. Or, if those miracles didn't occur, the fact that the world converted is itself a miracle. So either way, you've got a miracle. Either the world converted through miracles, or it didn't convert through miracles, and that would be a miracle greater than if it had converted through miracles. And then he compares it to Islam, and he finds Islam wanting in these things. He says, they did not present supernatural prodigies, right? Muhammad didn't claim to ever work a miracle. And that's important for us to know. And Muslims don't claim that he did. Right? He didn't work the miracles that Christ worked or that Moses worked. So Muhammad is in a very different class, in a sense, from Moses and Jesus. Secondly, they affirmed they were sent by the power of the sword, a sign that is not lacking, St. Thomas says, to bandits and tyrants. And then finally, no divine oracle of the prophets before him gave witness to him. Right? Muslims do not claim that anyone foretold that there would be another prophet after Christ. And nowhere in the Old Testament can you find evidence that after the Messiah there will be another great and final prophet. Right? So Muhammad had nothing before him in the way of prophecy to be a motive of credibility. So therefore, St. Thomas Aquinas concludes, those who believe in his word believe imprudently. And we could say the same of those who believe in Mormonism or Jehovah's Witnesses. Because, again, they're lacking motives of credibility. Take the Jehovah's Witnesses. They claimed, right from the outset, that they knew the date of the second coming, 74, and it didn't come true. And so they had to reschedule it, 1914, and it didn't come true, and they pushed it back, 1925, and then 60 or something, or 70, and then finally they scratched it altogether. That's lacking in, obviously, motives of credibility. Or the books of Mormon, right? In no place was it predicted that there would be new divine books that would be found. Right? So the motive of prophecy completely lacking. And then the books that he claimed to have found in the earth on these gold plates vanished afterwards. And it's true, some people testified that they had seen them, but what happened? They later retracted their testimony. And so you were just taking his word without any sign of something that only God could do. And then the revelation seems totally unreasonable to them. I won't go into it further, but now some people, what do Muslims claim? Why do they believe? The key motive of credibility is the beauty of the Quran. Now I can't really judge that, not reading Arabic, because they say that beauty you only see in the Arabic. But that's not a sufficient motive of credibility, because first of all, it's too subjective. How do you determine that this work is more beautiful than that? Right? How do I see that the Quran is more beautiful than, Romeo and Juliet? You need something that only God can do. Right? And so the beauty isn't a sufficient motive. And then likewise, the spread of Islam, that can be explained by natural causes. Right? It was spread by the sword and by the tremendous armies of the Prophet and his successors. And the same thing goes for Protestantism. Right? How did the spread of Protestantism is often cited as a proof that it was from God. But how did it spread? It spread very often through temporal motives the German princes having an incentive for rebelling against Rome, a temporal economic incentive, and obviously Henry VIII having a tremendous temporal incentive for breaking. And then what happened? It spread through multiplying. In other words, it doesn't have the note of unity that we see in the Catholic Church. We can understand that natural causes are enough for a doctrine to splinter into 10,000 different sects or denominations. Right? What's miraculous is that it remains one over 20 centuries. Okay. Those are the motives of credibility. Now, does that mean to say that people who believe in these other religions, like Islam, are insincere in their belief? No, I don't mean to imply that in any way. What I'm saying is that it's objectively imprudent because the objective motives of credibility are lacking. That doesn't mean that they don't believe sincerely, right? I'm sure most do believe sincerely, and perhaps they have merit for that before God, right? God only knows. But what we're saying is that there's not an objective basis for their belief, and that reason has something to say here, right? Very often people have the idea that in religion, reason simply doesn't enter. It's not a matter of being reasonable. That's a dangerous position. Theologians call that fideism. In other words, that pure faith and no reason. Because reason, God gave it to us to evaluate the reasonableness of faith. Now, faith is more than just reason. But what I'm saying is that the reasonableness of the claim has got to be there. Then on top of that, I need God's grace. See, we need two things to come to faith. A convert who comes to believe needs two things. He needs the reasonableness of the claim, and then he needs the grace of the Holy Spirit to open his eyes to see that reasonableness. Okay? So we've got these external motives of credibility, and then we've got the internal impulse of the Holy Spirit that leads us to believe. Right? And when those two come together, then we get the act of faith. And that's why St. Paul tells us, no one can believe in that Jesus is the Christ except through the Holy Spirit. Right? We need that internal motive as well. So reason is insufficient, but indispensable. Grace is sufficient and indispensable. Converts very often speak of the grace of the gift of faith as something sudden, right? A gift that came to them in one moment that they didn't have previously, right? They had perhaps the motives of credibility, but they were struggling with them, right? And then God helps us to overcome the struggle by giving us that inner certainty, right? That produces the act of faith. It's one Jewish convert who says that it happened, he had been investigating for months, and he received the gift of faith shaving one day. And he said he just received the gift of certainty. I heard no voice, I saw no vision. A thought came into my mind. It came very slowly. It was as if someone placed the words before me. Of course, Christ is God. How could you ever doubt it? Right? That's the gift of faith. His name was Paul Waldman. Anyway, you could go on and on. Every convert has their own story of when that gift was given to them. Okay, one final point before we close. So what we said up to now is that faith is our response to God who speaks. Okay, so God reveals himself, and faith is our response to that. And therefore, in a sense, faith is our gift back to God. He gives himself through his word, and in the act of faith, I give myself back to him by believing his word, by accepting his word, and by giving to him the obedience of faith. Now that obedience of faith means accepting his word as he has given it, not as I want it to be. Right? So that gift that we make, that gift of faith, has got to have an objective character, and therefore a dogmatic character. Right? In other words, God reveals himself by giving us certain truths about himself, and we call those dogmas. And the act of faith is a giving of my mind to him, and therefore accepting those dogmas. So the act of faith is dogmatic, as it were. Right? Cardinal Newman, he's an English Anglican convert to Catholicism, 19th century, a great theologian, a great hero of mine. He speaks of the dogmatic principle, that the act of faith, by its very nature, is an assent to dogma. Dogma being something unshakable, something that God has said, that is an article of faith. And so therefore, the act of faith and what we could call pick-and-choose Catholicism are incompatible. Right? The act of faith is a gift of my mind to God, and therefore I can't reserve it. I can't keep it as mine by saying, I believe this, but not that, because that's too difficult. Or that doesn't seem reasonable to me. Or that just is too much. That's incompatible with the gift of faith. Right? The reserving for myself the right to pick and choose. Now that's true both in Judaism and Catholicism. Right? Both Judaism and Catholicism, Orthodox Judaism, I mean, has this dogmatic character. The Orthodox Jews also have articles of faith, as we have in our creed. The great medieval Jewish philosopher and scholar of the Torah, Maimonides, gave a list, or 13 fundamental articles of faith in Judaism. God is the creator. It's the only God. Right? That's the first article. God is a spirit, unlike the bodies that He has created. He's the first and the last. God alone may be worshipped. All the words of the prophets are true. Moses is the father of all wise men. All his prophecies are true. Etc., etc. The Messiah will surely come. The dead will rise at the time set by God. And it ends, this recitation of the articles of faith. No one can be a true Jew if he doesn't profess these articles as true. Right? You can't pick and choose. Whoever denies even one of these articles is a heretic, Maimonides says. Right? And so it's very similar in its structure to what we say in the Mass in the Nicene Creed, or the Apostles' Creed. Right? They both have the same dogmatic principle. And Cardinal Newman has this great passage about the dogmatic principle. He says, to be a man of faith would be to hold that there is a truth, that there's one truth, and that error, religious error, is of an immoral nature. It's to be dreaded. The search for truth isn't the gratification of curiosity. Right? It's something much holier. Its attainment, religious truth, isn't the excitement of a discovery like in science. No. Truth and falsehood are set before us for the trial of our hearts. This is the dogmatic principle. This has strength. And this dogmatic principle has strength. In other words, believing in dogma has strength because it gives us a foundation that's firm. It was this kind of faith that enabled the prophets to give witness to the truth of God in the midst of terrible persecution. And it enabled David to write the Psalms. It enabled the Jewish people to maintain their identity throughout 30 centuries in the midst of the silence of God and in exile. It enabled the Middle Ages to build their cathedrals and write their summas. And it enabled people like St. Teresa and St. John of the Cross to make their mystic ascent to Mount Carmel. And so the dogmatic principle has strength. Whereas private judgment, or cafeteria Catholicism, is weak. It lacks that strength. And it makes it impossible to make the gift of one's mind to God. So ultimately, the necessity of obeying the Church, rather than our own opinions, is what really sets us free. It sets us free from ourselves, right? And enables us to make that gift of ourselves to God. And so let's pray always for an increase of that gift.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfoud. Good day.